how close did you live to a park when you were growing up? And did you use the park often? What was that experience like?
I was about equal distant from a playground that was for newer homes that they had in their section. It was kind of like behind the houses that I lived in. But right down the street from me at the end of the street was I think they're called like a stormwater drainage. We called it the pit. It was just a pit of concrete that you could go in. Now, if it rained a lot, it filled up. But if it was just a regular day, it was just a pit that you could go in. And that was where I learned how to ride a bike. 4 Degrees to the Streets is designed to empower anyone curious about places and spaces, not just persons with professional degrees or backgrounds. Here we will cover a host of topics, including transportation, health, housing, and the environment through the lens of racism, classism, and sexism, and give listeners the tools they need to overcome institutional barriers. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at the 4 Degrees Pod, and tune in every other Tuesday where Nemo and Jazz keep it 4 degrees to the streets. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the 4 Degrees to the Streets podcast. I'm Nemo, and we have
Jasmine.
How are you doing today?
It's okay. Everything's is going as best as it can. Yeah, I can't complain, honestly. I'm traveling soon and have some PTO at work, so I'm really looking forward to that. And you would think, like in California, there's nothing really because it's so sunny all the time, but like you still got to work out here in the sun. So, how you doing, Nemo?
That is real. On the other hand, I did all my traveling and do not have any trips planned. So I'm just here practicing stillness and finding peace throughout the days. But you look good. You all can't see us, but we look good.
I cut my hair, y'all. So, I don't know when we'll have some pictures out, but yeah. So I don't know if everybody knows what a big shop is, but that's done. And so everybody's out here.
Yes. Well, today we are excited for this topic. It dates back to an episode some of you all may remember, Grown Folks Business, Planning for Older Adults. And so, as you know, one of the missions of the podcast is to amplify urban planning topics for all backgrounds, but we also specifically emphasize groups who may be underrepresented or under considered truly in planning spaces. So today we're going to be talking about young people. So I'll turn it over to Jasmine.
So we wanted to have this episode for several reasons. You're having a conversation about older adults led us to thinking about, well, what about younger adults? A lot of planning kind of happens for able-bodied, middle-aged people, right, who are commuting to work and from work and stuff like that. But we wanted to spend some time thinking about younger children. So when we're describing children in this episode, we're thinking about people under the age of 18. So elementary, middle, and high school students, that K-12 range. And so just some high-level stats to kind of frame the conversation. When you think about a child, only 20% of their time is spent in a school. And so the remaining amount of their time, 80% of that time, is spent doing stuff with their family, traveling, playing outside or not playing outside. So they have all this time left to explore the built environment. And then when you look at it another way, children represent 9% of the United States population. And so not a insignificant percentage of the population. And so how they move around cities and towns and rural areas is critically important. We need to know how they operate, particularly because they're smaller, they are less mature, so they might take more risks than the rest of us. And so we wanted to create this episode dedicated to the kids. If you know a kid, bring them in. And so we want to explore how the built environment impacts and shapes their lives. We will explore how children play and travel. So we're taking this from a outdoor, literally playing, talking about parks, talking about green spaces, and then also talking about child pedestrian safety. And so, Nemo, just a question to get us started. How close did you live to a park when you were growing up? And did you use the park often? What was that experience like?
Yeah, so I would say I was kind of equal, and I grew up in the suburbs, as I think people know. Um, the suburbs of Seattle. There, I was about equal distant from a playground that was for newer homes that they had in their section. It was kind of like behind the houses that I lived in. But right down the street from me, at the end of the street, was I think they're called like a stormwater drainage. We called it the pit. It was just a pit of concrete that you could go in. Now, if it rained a lot, it filled up. But if it was just a regular day, it was just a pit that you could go in. And people, that was where I learned how to ride a bike in just this large concrete space. Um, but also lived walking distance from my elementary school that also, if it's in school's not in session, people could just go on that playground too. Or that park that was in a neighborhood for newer homes. But I would say, like, going into the area with the park for newer homes, it did feel like that was a close-knit community. And so people would be looking like, you don't live in these houses, like, why are you here? I had a friend who did. And so I think I would feel a little bit more secure when I was with her, because at least they know her and she lives with them. But still, two little Black girls in an area at the time that wasn't as diverse as it is now. Like, this is like 20 years ago, 20 less years ago. So yeah, that was like the first thoughts that come to mind when I think about like what my closest park access was. What about you?
I mean, I think it's interesting because a lot of towns, and maybe the town you lived in, had this requirement, but if you built a certain number of houses as like a development, you had to then build a public park for them to use. But I had never known anyone who lived in any of those new developments, and so I had never been in them. I also grew up in the suburbs, and I lived walking distance to several parks. um One on my street, another like around the corner, and then another kind of further away that I never really went to, but like if I wanted to go that far, I could, because my cousins lived over there. And I spent so much time at the park. Like, the park was a place I would go to all day Saturday, after church on Sunday, after school on the weekdays. I would meet all my friends there. Um, and then the McDonald's was close to the park, so go to McDonald's, eat at the park. Like, we had a great time. I spent a lot of time at the park. A lot of my fondest memories of my childhood were spent at that park. And it recently got redone, like, since I went home to visit my family. And I'm like, wow, this is such a much nicer park than it was when we was playing there. But times change and neighborhoods improve. But I don't know if kids really play outside like they used to. They have all this technology and stuff. So I don't know. But it's funny. I saw a tweet one time. It was like, one day you and your friends just never went back to the park. And I was like, that is so crazy. Like, we really did just like grow out of playing outside.
When you said you went back and it was a lot nicer, is it that they made improvements to that park, or?
Yeah, they improved the park. We have like a workout. There's like an outdoor workout section now. The basketball court is like paved, like newly paved. The tennis court is newly paved. The jungle gym area is brand new. Like, everything's brand new. And I mean, I had been going there for like 10 years of my life, and it had never been renovated. So it was likely time for it to happen. But it is an interesting time because suburban gentrification is prevalent. Nobody ever talks about it, but it's real.
Yeah, I wonder if we were to have like a baby Gen Z on this call, like what their, I think about, like, this might would kind of be like my brother who's 14. Like, if we were to ask him the same question of what's your park experience like, he might be like, I don't know, like, just shrug. Like, he may really not have an answer. Um, but we hope to have a follow-up episode on this topic where we get to speak with someone who's working with kids actively on in thinking about these topics. So I guess we will hear a little bit more about that. From another professional side, I wanted to highlight a landscape architect that's based in New York, Mr. Emmanuel Ting, and I hope I'm saying his last name right. I really do. But as we were doing research for this episode, he came up as super influential in terms of designing public spaces for children. And so he recently retired, I believe this year, from the New York City Parks and Rec Department after 30 years. And he first designed the magical play space in the neighborhood that he grew up in. And he grew up in the Crown Heights area in Brooklyn. And both for himself, he acknowledged how much parks allowed him the space to think. But I think the specific design elements that he was intentional about in the parks that he designed was also significant. In 2011, he won a Sloan Public Service Award for his ability to design and transform space, and was seen as a reason that New York has great parks and a green future. And some of the things that he prioritized, one of the playgrounds, they sit on a 5% grade. And so that is accommodating for both wheelchair users. So they're able to have a slope, whether that's, wheeling themselves. And I also think about mothers who may have strollers, where it's a little bit easier for them to push to, and acknowledging the curves in the landscape. He also prioritized natural spaces, so big trees, to make it feel more comfortable. And even though he's retired, in the article, which we'll link in the show notes, he said he'll probably keep sketching parks until the day he dies, and feels alive when he's doing it. And post-retirement, he's an advisor for New City Parks. That's a nonprofit organization that helps create parks for underserved communities. So as we mentioned in the beginning of this episode, thinking about children put underserved for various factors, whether that's based on race, income, geography, that's another theme throughout this episode as well. And so to dig into the data on some of that, there was a study done using 2010 census data that found that 61% of people between 5 and 17 lived within half a mile of a public park. However, only 18% lived within a census tract of half a mile of two parks. So that's another aspect. I don't think we've gotten it. We talked about parks in different episodes, but the density of how many people are in a space that you grew up in. And I just know Jersey is densely populated too. So even though there were those parks that were close, it makes me think about how many people and houses and kids were all trying to maybe use those parks at the same time, which doesn't impact the experience in the park. If you go to a park and you want to swing on a swing and everybody's on the swing and everybody's on the jungle gym, you're like, I'm just going to go home.
I think the concept of density is kind of more important than the distance to or distance from. Like, sure, there's census tracts in, let's take the densest place in the United States, in New York, where I'm throwing out a number, 1,000 people live in a half mile of a park, but we all can't use it. Like, so we need more than that. And so I think, and we were trying to find that kind of granular level data. But I think that would have been helpful too, is to understand like the density, or maybe people per park acre, something like that would have been a good reference also.
Yeah, in that study, one of their findings was that the main disparity in the data they saw with parks was between urban and rural. So they found that youth in urban areas have greater access to parks. Access just meaning that, like Jasmine said, the distance, how close that park may be to their home. But in rural areas, they don't live as close to parks. But then you can also maybe assume that those in rural areas, they have larger yards, or they have more space in their own home or their community that might not be considered a park, but maybe they have trails or other outdoor amenities. So that was one of the main disparities that they found between urban and rural. I think it's, when thinking about parks and access, it's also important to think about those who, at least what the study found, is that youth who have parks nearby are more physically active than those who do not live near parks. And when we think about the public health aspect of the built environment, if youth are not able to get outside or do not have a safe distance or a safe path to travel to get that physical activity, how that impacts their physical health too.
Yeah, and I think it's really important in terms of the park space, because it's a public resource. In a lot of urban areas, you have to pay to do sports, after school programs and stuff like that. And so that's where a lot of kids get their physical activity. They might run track, play football, play basketball, play soccer, play tennis, whatever. But those are things that you need equipment. You need to pay to have a tennis racket, pay to have a baseball bat, pay to have gloves. Like, those are things you have to buy. The park you can just go to and run around or swing or jump. And so having the access and access to a quality park too is like critically important.
And so with thinking about some of those stats and park access and just public space in general when it comes to kids, The Brookings Institute is leading a concept that's been up and coming for the last few years called Playful Learning Landscapes, or PLL. And so this came up, this got some traction during COVID, granted the conditions of the world that we were in and kids were not going to school. But Brookings and other cities and other organizations are trying to continue this momentum that was gained during COVID to think about what are kids doing outside of the classroom. And so in some of their reports, it shared by 2030, up to 60% of the world's urban population will be under 18 years old. And when thinking about that for the future, which 2030 is not that far away, but city development, like Jasmine mentioned earlier, a lot of what we see of cities today was developed during the industrial age. And at that time, they were just thinking about the men's who were working during that time and how they got around, but they weren't considering women, children, or older adults. And that's still a lot of the structures that we see in place today. And so one of the major tenets of the PLL and Playful Learning Landscapes is thinking about child-friendly urban planning, is to combine learning as children are in their prime developmental years, and then looking at their development both in school and out of school. And so PLL's main aim is to address learning inequalities that exist outside of the classroom, because 20% of the time is in the classroom versus 80% of time that they spend outside of the classroom. And I don't know if I felt that way when I was growing up. Like, I felt like school was my life, but now I feel like when I come home from work, now it feels like I feel like 80% of my time feels like I'm working, and then 20% is me doing other stuff. I don't know. But, you know, yeah, kids do just maybe have that free time where they're not bogged down by other tasks because they just go to school and they can go home. But that's huge, that 80% of their time in how they learn. And I think, we know now, to really learn something and be immersed in it, it has to consume a lot of your time outside of just the classroom, or outside of that one session a week or 2 sessions a week that you may have with an instructor. And so that's really what this concept of Playful Learning Landscapes is trying to take: the built environment, community, and education, and bridge it all together. And so some of the examples that they try to make this concept come to life, they do it in parks, laundromats, supermarkets, bus transit, libraries, and streets. And so I thought the laundromat example was interesting, especially in urban areas where they may not have laundry facilities at home, but a lot of kids may go with their parents to do laundry. This is random, but I feel like kids are always in Costco. So I wonder what a playful learning landscape would look like in Costco.
It's funny because the kids are definitely always in the grocery store, Costco, Target, and I'm like, as a single person without kids, I'm like, I need to bring y'all kids. Like, ain't nobody at the house that you can stay. And I was a kid that I left. I know when you're supposed to, but I sat in the car, like, crack the window, don't get out, don't let nobody in, and wait right here till I get back. Like, that's how I grew up. But I'd be like, damn, you got to bring your kids with you everywhere.
Right. No offense. But see, I was definitely in the Costco and in the grocery stores, but I knew better than to just run around. I wasn't just going to be running around. I was very much stayed with my parent, went down the aisles, and was behaved. But so the Clinton Foundation, former President Bill Clinton's philanthropy organization, they had a PLL concept called Transforming Laundromats. And so they partnered with the Laundry Cares Foundation to develop tools and resources that created playful, literary rich spaces for children inside laundromats. And so they created literacy programming with using libraries in over 5,000 laundromats. So they received signage, toolkits, and other educational materials. And I felt like that was really cool. Like, you're going to the laundromat thinking, you're just going to be sitting there. Or maybe, these days they might just give the child an iPad or something to distract them, but to go into a space and have built-in ready-made materials to continue their education and bring that space to life. Something similar was done in supermarkets, also by the Clinton Foundation. And so they define this as a low-cost intervention to spark adult-child conversations. And so one, enriching their language, but then also using the physical environment of a supermarket to do that. And then also they had some if English is not your first language, they had concepts for that as well. And then thinking about streets, I know also during COVID, open street concepts became popularized, shutting off streets to cars. And so Philly created play streets where they closed streets during the summer. And in order for a organization to take part in this or to be a lead, they had to offer summer meals. So not only would they close the street, but they would also be able to provide food, especially again during COVID, seeing those students who were not in school and maybe not getting free and reduced lunch, not knowing where their meals were coming from. So I thought it was important that they prioritize both nutrition, learning, and public space through that example.
I always like the open street concepts and things like that because um streets are very dangerous for kids. Like they used to tell us like, "Oh, look both ways before you cross the street." But now there's so many other distractions. You have your cell phone that can distract you as you're driving or as you're walking. There's big old screen in your car that you got to click around and figure out everything can distract you while you're driving. And then I'm consistently on Twitter because I'm in planning Twitter, seeing like these huge trucks and then like a kid in front of it. And like if you were driving this truck, you couldn't see. And I don't know what regulation is happening, but those trucks are a problem. Like I've walked past them and I'm not a child and I couldn't see over the grill of the truck. And I'm like, how is this even? And then some people put tires on and so now they even higher off the ground. It's like, that doesn't seem like it's safe at all. Like if you can't see someone at a crosswalk, how are you going to know that they're in the crosswalk like before you drive through it? It doesn't make any sense. That's just one example. And then I remember when the streets came out during COVID, I thought those were a great idea. I do remember an article, maybe we can find it and link it in the show notes, but it talked about like the disparity of how they were scattered across the city. So did you see anything in Philly that was like they made sure it was an equitable distribution of the play streets?
I did not, but they did do some evaluation reporting specifically on that project. A lot of these things kicked off in like 2021, 2022. So they're still analyzing how they want to do future evaluation too. But I know specifically in Philly, they did a little bit of a deeper dive. So we can add that. But that was kind of what I was going to close this section with is at least the information is out there and accessible if you're currently working for a city or currently working for an organization that wants to think about public space for kids and for the youth. And they really have, a library of best practices of what you can do. A lot of these, well, one of the main takeaways from this initial round of projects is that it does take a lot to be meaningful in terms of making sure that the information is everywhere. So if this is one community, there needs to be learning spaces at the grocery stores, there needs to be learning spaces at the libraries, there needs to be learning spaces at the bus stops and transit hubs. It can't just be like one scattered. It needs to be a consistent thing that a child is seeing in their neighborhood, that they can have these learning opportunities to be effective. And so their main advice too is to bring in child developmental experts and developmental scientists to be part of the team, working with designers and urban planners. And I think Jasmine's going to get into this in a bit with thinking about traffic safety, but I think it's been a couple years in the making now where planners, engineers have been thinking about safety for all people on the roadway. And I think that's a cultural shift in the space that can also be done when thinking about planning for young people. And so I think acknowledging that cultural shift is bringing in educational experts into conversations when we think about designing spaces, especially in improvement projects. And so that was another recommendation, is that this doesn't have to be huge standalone projects, but when spaces are, when bus stations are having upgrades planned, or, I often see a lot of supermarkets will maybe change their location from one space in a town to another space or a larger space. Libraries often have facelifts and budgets to do certain things in their spaces as well. Closing a street, that's a couple permits and a budget away. Like, these things are possible to do. So I would just encourage anyone listening, if that is their daily work, to think about how to incorporate it.
Before I go into child traffic or child pedestrian safety, just flipping it back to you, Nemo, how did you get to school every day? in elementary, middle, and high school? And what did you have any transportation challenges or anything like that?
Yeah, so for elementary school, I walked to school. I would say it was about a mile uphill. Um, Middle school also walked to school, and there was no sidewalk until a new housing development was built on the other side of that street, and then they had a sidewalk on that side. But I believe it was facing the opposite way, like you want to be walking towards traffic. If I was to walk on that side of the street, I would be walking with my back to traffic, like depending on either way, just one sidewalk on one side of the street isn't great. But yeah, for a while that I haven't gone back to that road since I've been back. So I wonder if they have sidewalks on both sides now. But middle school was a bit of a risk, but we would often be walking in big groups. And even part of my walk to elementary school also didn't have a sidewalk. I do remember a crossing guard when I kind of got to the main road that my school was on. And then high school had a bus.
In a group, what do you mean? Like a couple kids from your neighborhood would all leave together at the same time to walk to school together?
Yeah, or we just naturally, school got out and we would just be in a cluster walking.
And then in the morning, would you guys meet up to walk also together to school?
In the morning, it was a little bit more spread out. So it was never really planned meeting, but yeah.
That's interesting. You walked to school in elementary school a whole mile. So you were like 7 and you were walking?
Well, walking.
I think, and it's, I know you lived in the suburbs, but it's just so interesting to me because my, like, wasn't no walking going on. I lived so far from my schools. And this goes into urban planning also because the part of town that I lived in was like an older part of town. So all of the houses where I lived were totally different. Every single house was somebody built this house. When the town continued to grow, it was more development. So somebody would come and buy up several acres and then build a bunch of houses and might make 5 copies of the house. That is where the town started to like form. So those are where the schools and stuff were located. So those kids could walk to school. My cousins who lived over there would walk to school. My grandfather dropped me off at school every day in elementary school. And then in middle school, I got on the bus. And in high school, I rode the bus until people I knew had cars, and I would ride in their cars. Or when I got a car, I would drive myself to school. But none of this, I couldn't have walked to any of those schools. Yeah, no, there was no way. My high school was basically on a highway. Like,
I was
so
about to say there was a highway, a median, a barrier. What's the jug handle?
yeah, there's like a
Between.
traffic circle. There's so much stuff to get to that school. So I never had the pleasure of walking, but I think it's so interesting to know that that's like that young. Like, I can't imagine walking. I can't imagine. I have nieces. I can't imagine sending my nieces out to like walk to school. And then, so this brings up the concept that I wanted to get into with this. Is I'm glad that you talked about that, because a lot of kids don't go to school in their town or in their district, particularly if they go to private school or charter school. So the walking aspect of it is not possible. A lot of kids take public transportation to their school because they're going to school outside of their main district. Maybe their town, maybe the city has school choice, but maybe there's like open district. Like in LA, it's an open district. So whether you live in, well, that's not the same town. Whether you live in the like Mid Wilshire area or you live in South Central, it's Los Angeles Unified School District. So you can go to school in any of those districts. But what it often means is that kids in low performing districts, often minority and low income districts, are commuting far to get to schools in better performing districts, often whiter and more affluent districts. I know several people who are from like the Inglewood, South Central area, and they would have to get up. School might start at 8. They're on the bus at like 6 in the morning, getting all the way across town to go to school and then doing it again at nighttime, all because the school in their district is terrible. And so this is where all of the aspects of planning come into play, right? So you have the transportation aspect of it all, right? How is the bus schedule set up for somebody trying to get to grade school, or is it for somebody trying to get to work, right? Like, how is the schedule and where's the stations? And then there's a question of school quality. Like, how does school quality, which I feel like is like right outside of planning in a way, impact transportation decisions? We know it impacts where people want to choose to live, right? I might choose to buy a house if I'm planning on having a family in a school district that's like a better neighborhood. When we see a lot of deals, that might be something that they quote, like, oh, this is in a grade A school district or something like that, because they're trying to market it to families. But school quality impacts your transportation and like your ability to move. And I've always lived in a town that was not a unified schools district, and so you had to go to the school that you were assigned to. And I just happened to live in a town where all the schools were great schools to go to. But I know that that is a privilege that I had that a lot of kids don't experience, particularly kids that look like me.
Yeah, I feel like it's definitely brings in like the urban form and living in an urban environment, which, now I think we're in a place where various incomes and like social backgrounds are choosing to live in cities versus at different times in history where the inner city was um reserved for people with lower incomes, and then everyone was in the suburbs, and now it's kind of mixed. And I think with that mixing brings in the school quality and the transportation challenges, because I don't know how much local transit authorities are really thinking, especially local transit authorities that that are in places where they don't have school buses, are thinking about planning for students. I know a lot of times in DC, it's well, these kids aren't paying and they're jumping over the fare gates or they're causing trouble or doing that, versus like, how can we help this structure so that they can get to school safely? Like, I don't know how much local transit authorities are in the safe routes conversations.
No, the kids in DC are so funny. That summer I spent there, they would definitely just be hanging out, jumping over the thing. I'm like, I like these kids. um, so to transit, I'll jump to transit really quickly. A lot of um like the MTA in New York has a program where if you're using the train for school, it's like a free, the kids have like a special pass. LA has a similar thing. Interesting though, your school has to, so some kind of way the school is paying for this to happen. The school has to kind of have the partnership with the transit authority because they acknowledge that kids are riding the bus or the train to get to their school. And so they might pay the transit authority X number of dollars so that they can have certain number of passes. Like, it's a relationship between the school and the transit authority. So I thought that was interesting. And I do know my friends who are from LA that have lived here and went to school here. That's what they did. They had like a free pass that let them get. But that doesn't stop the fact that, so you just walked a mile by yourself or with kids to school, but some people are traveling like 10 miles to get to school on a bus, and you're like 12. Like, that's kind of I would be terrified. Like, I'm sometimes terrified on the train by myself, and I'm a grown woman. So I'm trying to think about me being a kid and like having a backpack and all sorts of stuff, but crime is everywhere and danger is everywhere. To get to pedestrian safety and walking, to Nemo's experience walking, in a 3-year period between 2017 and 2020, 2,500 kids died from pedestrian injuries related to their walking throughout their town. The highest demographic being teenagers, people from age 15 to 19 years old, and children in non-metro areas. So those rural and more suburban leaning areas die 40% more than children in metro areas. And maybe that's because they're walking further, or the landscape is even less so designed for pedestrian safety, but that is a fact. And so a lot of child pedestrian fatalities and child pedestrian safety issues can be improved with the same things that we talked about in our episode for older adults. That's why they have a lot of organizations called 8 to 80 cities, thinking about people, the world from 8 to 80. And in planning, we talk about the concept of, if you plan for the most vulnerable population, you've planned for everyone, right? So if you plan for the person with the disability, you've also planned for me without a disability, right? Because it's accessible to everyone. And so when you plan for children, when you plan for seniors, you're planning for everyone. Nobody else is going to be harmed by making something um more convenient for a more vulnerable person. And so a lot of those recommendations, it's interesting, the issue of child pedestrian safety has gone up into a public health crisis. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is the professional organization for pediatricians and all like people who are involved in child health, they put out a policy statement in 2023 on child pedestrian safety, and they recommended a couple things for street design that would improve child safety. The first being reducing speed limits, to have 20 mile per hour zones, to have photo speed cameras in school zones, to add crossing guards at intersections adjacent to school. So Nemo saw that crossing guard when she got close to her school, to advocate for pedestrian infrastructure in terms of changing the roadways, and to develop a robust surveillance system to collect data on child safety and injury networks. And so when I read that list, I was like, well, this is everything we need to do anyway. We need to make streets safer for everyone. And so that's the concept of planning for the most vulnerable population. In terms of, this is a fact that I thought was interesting in LA. My grandmother was a crossing guard, and I just took it for granted. Like, I thought every school district had a certain number of crossing guards, but it's not the case. In LA, and I'm sure it's probably the same in other large cities like New York or Chicago, you have to ask for a crossing guard. You're not just assigned one. And in LA, there's like a criteria. When I went to the website, it also had a flag saying like, this is sure it's a crossing guard. So you could put in your request now, but TBD on when we're gonna assign you one. And to me, that's just crazy. Like, put a police officer out there or somebody. Like, all these people working, all these people that need jobs, in a crossing guard could be a job. Like, they get $20 an hour, they work for like 4 hours a day. Like, that's nothing, but it's something for different people, and it's helping child safety. But
I know even for the crossing guard that's on the outside of the neighborhood where I live now, um, in DC, and like when I'm coming back from the gym in the morning, even just seeing her standing there in like bright yellow does something to make sure I'm aware, because in my mind, I'm a safe driver. I am, y'all, but there's just like, I'm like, oh, let me get home, shower, because I got to go to work. There's kids around. And so even just seeing her presence there, I feel like is important. Yeah, I know a lot of people complain about photo speed limit, but it's making you, it's gonna, if that's what it takes to make you slow down, especially around young people. And even the stats you read on the deaths, it just like breaks my heart. That, and we all need to be more careful, and we all, every minute we step out onto the street, whether it's us just walking across the road to Target, whether, we park our cars and walk, we become a pedestrian, and we become also vulnerable, like Jasmine was saying, to these incidents as well, no matter how old we are.
yeah, DC is notorious for their photo speed cameras, particularly on certain streets. I think Florida Avenue is one of them. And when I go down Florida Avenue, you come off that beltway trying to get into DC, better slow yo behind down. They done got me about 2 or 3 times, and I don't play when I'm on that street now. Everybody put your brakes on, because I'm not trying to get no $50 ticket in the mail that you're gonna forget, and now it's $150 before you know it. And I do think those cameras are effective, because sometimes, and it's tricky because sometimes they can create like an equity issue, because if you're enforcing right without changing the landscape or changing the infrastructure, are you just trying to create revenue? Like, we know that narrower lanes reduce speeding, right? But you didn't narrow the lane. So you still have 15-foot lanes, but you're telling me the speed limit is 25 miles per hour. There's no traffic lights for 5 miles, but the speed limit is supposed to be 25 miles per hour. And so you're going to give me a ticket. But at what point do you generate enough revenue from these tickets to narrow the street? Like, that's the part where the infrastructure and the enforcement always like play into each other for me. To get to the transit piece, I want to bring this up and not lose it. 4% of transit riders are actually between the age of 15 and 19 years old nationwide. That's from APTA, which I'm going to forget the name of that, but it's like the American Association of Public, I got it, Public
Yeah.
Transit professionals.
American Public Transit Association.
There you go. Thank you,
Public
Nemo.
Transportation Association, I think is what they are.
So 4%, a small number, but not really, right? When you think about all of the people who are riding the train at or transit and bus, train and bus at any time, 4% of them are teenagers. Like that's pretty significant. And then a greater share of them are on the bus versus the train. So 2 times the number of kids riding the train are on the bus. And so that was shocking to me because it makes sense, right? Often train stations are not near schools. Bus stops have a particular unique in that they can be located like pretty closely to multiple things at the same time. And so that made sense for me to see the kids more likely on the bus. And then when your kid is riding transit, there's a whole nother set of rules they have to abide by. They got to know the train schedule, know the bus route. They got to know to stay away from that little yellow line so they don't get hit by the train when it's coming out. They got to have transit fare. They have to learn how to then navigate the street again. So there's a concept that everybody's a pedestrian, whether you're walking from your house to your driveway, from your building to your parking garage, or from your bus stop to your final destination. At some point, you're going to be a pedestrian along your journey. Having longer commute times. If you're on the bus, that means that you're probably going more than a walking distance. You're probably going 2 or 10 miles and then arriving to school on time. If the bus is late, you're going to be late. If you miss your bus, you're going to be late. And so tardiness is like a huge thing. You can get suspended and all that stuff for being late to school. And so the Urban Institute, which we love, has a report on Road to School, which analyzes commute time in various cities that offer school choice. And so they looked at Denver, DC, New York, New Orleans, and Detroit. And the data showed that on average, students living in poverty versus students not living in poverty live within the same distance they live within the same distance to schools, right? So there might be schools in those areas. However, the quality of that school differs dramatically, so much so that affluent students are more likely to go to school in their district, whereas low income students are more likely to pass the school in their district on their way to another district to get to school. And so in planning, we talk a lot about this jobs housing mismatch where people have to live further away from job centers and then commute further. But it seems like there's also a schools to housing mismatch in terms of people are living near these schools, but the schools aren't quality enough. And so I was kind of left with this episode thinking about like, are planners doing enough to influence schools and education and like what can be done more so that people don't have to pass their elementary school, their middle school, their high school on their way to get to a better one?
Yeah, I feel like that really leaves like the open thoughts about where education and planning collide. Because even thinking about it just from like development of like new schools, like we talked about earlier in your neighborhood, like schools were built to match where newer homes were being built. And were those schools good? And then like 10 years later, are they still like the same quality? Like who knows how that goes? And then schools are pretty set in their places too, so they don't move as much like other things in the built environment. They're not moving as much. But then I don't know, do people move more than their school? Like how does one think about like the long range planning of schools and transportation and housing? Just my
The
thoughts.
unfortunate part about schools is that they might not move, but they close. In reading the Detroit and New Orleans, of course, dealing with Hurricane Katrina, so many of their schools just never reopened, whether because of damage or because of population loss. Meek Mill, we love rappers on this podcast, but Meek Mill is like, he said something in one of his songs like they closing all the schools, but the prisons getting opened. And that spoke to me in a very particular way because it might not be a direct correlation, right? But it's saying something about where we are in society, that schools are closing, but we keep building more prisons. And so what is going on in the world? Are we missing something? Is education, if we're lacking so much education across low income minority populations, when you're not and I'm not gonna say formally trained, but education is strongly related to like crime. So when you don't have a positive education in your life, you can't find a good job, you can't do all these things. You need to eat, you need money some kind of way. So what are you gonna do? And so that's a conversation that is beyond the scope of this episode in particular, but school and planning, education and planning is something that's always been like just right outside of our topic. Like we'll go to transportation, we'll go to land use, we'll go to housing, but like planners and transport and education, there's not enough conversation in my opinion about it.
Even just thinking about this episode, there were so many different directions that we wanted to go, and that's why we said we want to have a follow-up conversation. And I wouldn't be surprised if it comes up again throughout this season and future episodes. But this was just a little teaser. We hope that you all like. Well, one, we want to hear from you all. Other conversations about this that you all might be thinking that we didn't capture in this episode. So please send us an email. Reach out to us on social media. And stay tuned for more of these both internal, external fringe conversations around planning. And we drop episodes every other Tuesday. And you can find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, or Instagram at the 4 Degrees Pod.
Peace out, y'all.